This isn't a story about revenge. I want to say that up front, because I know how it's going to sound by the end. It's about the moment you realize the people you trusted most were never who you thought they were, and what you do when you can't unknow that. My grandfather turned 83 last October. He still mows his own lawn, still drinks black coffee before sunrise, and reads the newspaper the old way, paper copy folded in half. He worked 31 years as a civil engineer for the county before he retired, and in all that time, I never once heard him complain about a single day of it. That's who he is. Quiet, steady, the kind of man who shows up early and leaves late and doesn't ask for recognition. He called me in September, about 3 weeks before his birthday, and told me he had something he wanted to give me. He said he'd been thinking about it for a while. He said, "You've been working hard, and I'm proud of you, and I want to help." I told him he didn't need to do that. He said, "I know I don't need to. That's why I want to." A week later, my uncle called me, my mother's younger brother. He said Grandpa was tired and that the family had agreed to keep the birthday dinner small this year. Just close family. He said I wasn't on the list. I didn't push back. I probably should have, but I didn't want to cause a scene over a birthday dinner. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. 2 days after the dinner, I called my grandfather to wish him a happy birthday. He answered on the second ring and sounded genuinely happy to hear from me. We talked for maybe 20 minutes, mostly about nothing. His garden, a book he was reading, the weather, and then at the end of the call, I thanked him for the $100 he'd sent me. The check had arrived in the mail that week, with a little note in his handwriting. I told him it meant a lot. He went quiet. Not the pause of a man searching for the right words. The pause of a man who has just heard something that doesn't make sense. $100, he said. "Yeah," I said. "The check you sent." Another pause. Then he said, "The gift I sent you was $5,000. I remember the exact second those words landed. I was standing in my kitchen holding a cup of coffee, and I set it down on the counter very slowly, like I was afraid the sound would break something. "What?" I said. $5,000, he repeated. "I wired it directly from my account. I have the confirmation number." My grandfather is not a man who makes mistakes about money. He worked for 30 years doing exactly this kind of thing. Numbers, documentation, verification. He was not confused. He was not misremembering. Someone had intercepted $5,000 meant for me and replaced it with a $100 check. I said, "Grandpa, I only got 100. My voice sounded strange to me, very flat. He said, "I know what I sent." There was a long silence on the line. And then he said something that I keep coming back to, even now. He said, "I think we need to have a conversation as a family." That should have been the end of it. I should have driven to his house that day and sat down with him and worked it out together. But I didn't. And the reason I didn't is because I got a call from my uncle about 20 minutes after I hung up with my grandfather, and my uncle told me that Grandpa was confused sometimes and that I should give him some grace and that the money situation was being handled. I asked what that meant. He said, "It means it's being handled." That was the first time I understood that my uncle was involved. Not as a problem solver, as a participant. My grandfather lives alone. My grandmother passed away 6 years ago, and since then, the management of his day-to-day finances has been split unofficially between my mother and my uncle. They both live within 20 minutes of his house. I live 2 hours away. That distance, I would come to understand, was not incidental. I started making notes that same evening. Just a plain notebook, the kind you get at a drugstore. I wrote down the date of my grandfather's call, the exact words he used, the amount he said he'd sent, the confirmation number he gave me. Then I wrote down my uncle's call, the phrases he used, confused sometimes, being handled. I wrote down the date of the birthday dinner, and the date my uncle told me not to come. I didn't know what I was building yet. I just knew I needed to write it down before the edges of it got soft. Over the next 2 weeks, I visited my grandfather 3 times. I didn't announce the visits. I drove 2 hours each way, showed up at his front door, and had coffee with him. He was sharp. He knew exactly what day it was, who I was, what he'd eaten for breakfast. He remembered specific conversations we'd had months earlier. He was not confused. What he was, I realized, was lonely. On my second visit, he showed me his bank statements. He didn't offer at first. I asked carefully, and he pulled out a folder from the filing cabinet in his office and set it on the table between us. He knew what we were looking for. He'd been looking himself. The statement showed the wire transfer. $5,000, sent to an account he didn't recognize. He said he'd given my uncle account information to help facilitate the transfer. He said my uncle had told him it was my account. It was not my account. There was more. Going back through the statements, I found 3 other transfers over the past 14 months, all of them made through my uncle, all of them to accounts my grandfather had never verified independently. The total, across all 4 transactions, was just under $42,000. I sat across from my grandfather and I watched him go through those pages. He didn't say much. He just looked at the numbers, and then he looked up at me, and his expression was something I don't have a clean word for. It wasn't anger, exactly. It was closer to grief. Like watching someone discover that a door they'd always believed was locked had actually been standing open for years. He said, I trusted him. I said, I know. He said, he's family. I said, I know. I didn't say what I was thinking, which was, that's exactly why he did it. The question I kept turning over was what to do next. I was 28 years old. I had no legal background. I had a grandfather who was heartbroken and a family who was already closing ranks. I had a notebook and a stack of bank statements and a wire transfer confirmation number. I also had my grandfather's trust and I was not going to waste it. I started with the bank. I went to the branch where my grandfather had his primary account and asked to speak with a manager. I explained the situation calmly and factually. I used the phrase potential financial elder abuse, and I watched the manager's posture change. I said I had documentation of unauthorized transfers and that I was requesting a fraud review. That phrase, financial elder abuse, is the one that moves people. Not my uncle stole money or I think something wrong happened. Financial elder abuse has a legal definition. Banks have protocols for it. The manager told me she'd have someone from their fraud department contact us within 3 business days. They called the next morning. Over the following 3 weeks, I gathered everything I could. Bank statements going back 2 years, a copy of my grandfather's original wire transfer confirmation, a record of every phone call between my uncle and my grandfather that my grandfather could recall and document. I also discovered, while going through a folder of papers in my grandfather's filing cabinet, a document I had not been expecting to find. A power of attorney form, dated 14 months ago, right around when the first unauthorized transfer occurred. My grandfather's signature was on it. The document named my uncle as his financial agent. I brought it to my grandfather and asked if he remembered signing it. He stared at it for a long time. He said he remembered my uncle bringing some paperwork over for him to sign. He said he hadn't read it carefully. He said my uncle had told him it was just a formality for the account transfer process. My grandfather had a degree in civil engineering. He built bridges for a living. He was one of the most careful, detail-oriented people I had ever known, and he had signed a document giving his son near total control over his finances without reading it. Because his son told him not to worry about it. That's not confusion. That's trust being weaponized. The power of attorney complicated things. It meant my uncle had legal authority, on paper, to conduct those transactions, but it didn't mean the transactions were legal. A power of attorney is a fiduciary responsibility. It requires the agent to act in the grantor's interest, not their own. Using it to redirect funds intended for someone else into accounts controlled by the agent is a violation of that duty. I learned that from an elder law attorney I found online and called on a Tuesday afternoon. She gave me 30 minutes on the phone and told me what I was describing was potentially actionable as financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. She said the POA didn't protect my uncle. It potentially made things worse for him because it proved he had deliberate, documented access. I wrote that down too. My grandfather revoked the power of attorney the following week. He did it in writing, with 2 witnesses and a notary. He didn't tell my uncle or my mother beforehand. He just did it quietly, the same way he did everything else. I sat with him at his kitchen table while he signed the revocation, and afterward he made us both coffee, and we sat there for a while without talking. Then he said, "How long do you think this has been going on?" I said, 14 months at least. He nodded slowly. I kept wondering why my account felt lower than it should. He had mentioned it to my mother twice, apparently. She told him he was probably forgetting small expenses. She told him getting older makes you lose track of things. She said it with love, he said. She said it like she was looking out for him. The week after my grandfather revoked the POA, my uncle showed up at his house unannounced. I know because my grandfather called me right afterward, his voice very steady, the way it gets when he is keeping himself controlled. He said my uncle had come to ask about some account changes and had been, in his word, agitated. My uncle called me the next day. He said my grandfather was getting confused and making decisions that weren't in his best interest. He said I had been filling his head with ideas. He said I needed to step back and let the family handle it. I said, "Which family?" He didn't answer that. 2 weeks later, the bank's fraud department completed their review. They flagged 3 of the 4 transfers as potentially unauthorized, based on the documentation we'd provided, and the inconsistencies in the transaction records. They froze the accounts associated with those transfers pending further investigation. They also referred the case to their Elder Financials Protection Unit, which filed a report with the state's Adult Protective Services. The APS investigator called my grandfather directly. She was professional and thorough, and she treated him with complete respect. She sat with him for 2 hours. She reviewed the documents. She spoke with his doctor, who confirmed that he was cognitively competent and had been at every assessment for the past 4 years. My mother stopped calling my grandfather around that time. My uncle sent a single text message saying he was consulting with an attorney and would have no further comment. The investigation took 4 months. By the end of it, the total confirmed in unauthorized transfers was $38,400. My uncle's attorney initially argued that all transactions were authorized under the POA. The investigator's response was to ask for documentation of how those funds had been used for my grandfather's benefit. My uncle's attorney asked for additional time to respond. They never produced the documentation. My uncle and his wife reached a civil settlement with my grandfather in February. The terms included full repayment of the $38,400 plus legal fees. There is also a pending criminal referral from APS that, as of right now, has not been resolved. I'm not going to say what I think should happen there, because that's not mine to say. My grandfather makes his own choices. What I can say is this: my grandfather is doing well. He hired a professional fiduciary to manage his financial affairs going forward. Someone with no family connection, with bonded accountability, with legal obligations that are documented and reviewable. He still drinks black coffee before sunrise. He still mows his own lawn. He called me last month just to talk, and we ended up on the phone for an hour and a half about nothing in particular. At the end of that call, he said, "I'm sorry you had to do all that." I said, "You would have done it for me." He didn't say anything, but I heard him smile. You can hear it in his voice if you know what to listen for. There's something that still bothers me, and I've turned it over more times than I can count. My grandfather trusted people he loved. He didn't fail to read a document because he was careless or naive. He read it the way any of us would read something handed to us by a family member. He assumed good faith. He assumed that someone who said, "Don't worry about it," was telling him the truth. That assumption was used against him, deliberately, over 14 months, in small increments designed to stay just below the threshold of noticeability. That's not a mistake. That's a system. The thing I keep wanting to say, to anyone who has a grandparent or a parent or someone they love who's getting older, is that it usually doesn't look dramatic. It doesn't look like theft. It looks like someone helping out with the bills. It looks like paperwork being handled. It looks like family. Ask questions anyway. Offer to sit with them when they sign things. Learn the phrase financial elder abuse, and don't be afraid to use it with a bank manager, because it will make them pay attention in a way that something seems wrong never will. My grandfather told me the wire transfer was $5,000, and that was the first domino. I almost didn't ask about it. I almost let it go because I didn't want to make things uncomfortable. I'm glad I didn't. Some things are worth the discomfort. This was one of them.